we started renting things in Japan, and they didn't really, first of all, they were not in very good condition. They were very expensive. So at the end of the day, we made about 2,300 costumes. We still rented about 1,000 pieces that we sort of incorporated here and there.
Hello and welcome to the Art of Costume podcast. I am your host, Spencer Williams, and thank you so much for joining me for another bonus episode. Hello, costume nerds. How art thou? Happy spring. Spring has sprung. I hope you're enjoying plenty of time outdoors. I know I am. I'm getting outside and having my iced latte walks around the neighborhood and listening to podcasts, enjoying all the allergy medication I get to consume on what feels like an hourly basis. All the good things that come of being outside. I want to thank you all first for listening. I hope you enjoyed our Star Wars and our Loki episode with costume designer Christine Wada. Love reading all your messages about those episodes and all the costumes you all loved. And of course, all of the great costume facts that came out of the Star Wars episode that Elizabeth so brilliantly put together. We really enjoy our Star Wars episodes and, look forward to it every May to celebrate May the 4th because we are real-time nerds. With that, I am so excited for you all to get into our spring episodes. We have a lot of great episodes coming up. The one we're about to talk about. We also have The Mummy coming soon, which I know I'm dying to talk about. Elizabeth was just at the theater seeing it as well. It's an A+ movie. And then we have some really nerdy things coming up. For example, we have a Follow episode coming soon, which I'm very excited about. And we're finally going to be talking about the Gilded Age soon. And I just got to say, we have an extra special guest for that one that you're all going to want to hear from because, Elizabeth and I love the Gilded Age. With that being said, don't forget to leave us a 5-star text review on Apple Podcast or rate us on Spotify. It really does help. It helps us get noticed so we could grow our costume design cult. Also, we post YouTube videos now every Wednesday on YouTube. So after the episode comes out on Tuesday, listen to us on a podcast. But if you want to see some visuals later on, join us again on YouTube where you could see some of the pictures that we talk about. Maybe some of the visuals that designers are talking about themselves. You can see those on YouTube. With that, let's get into today's episode, which is, of course, about one of the greatest shows on television right now, Shōgun. I mean, if you haven't seen this show yet, I don't know what to say. It is a flawless, beautiful series, and I loved every second of it. Every detail in this series is it's a masterclass. I loved it, and I'm so excited to talk about it because there's a lot to say. So let's start with a summary. Shōgun follows the collision of two ambitious men from different worlds. John Blackthorne, a risk-taking English sailor who ends up shipwrecked in Japan, a land whose unfamiliar culture will ultimately redefine him, and Lord Toranaga, a shrewd, powerful daimyo at odds with his own dangerous political rivals, and of course, Lady Mariko, a woman with invaluable skills but dishonorable family ties who must prove her value and allegiance. And that is Shōgun. Now let's dive behind the costumes. Shōgun was created by Justin Marks, who is the co-creator and showrunner, as well as co-creator Rachel Kondo. And costume design was done by the one and only Carlos Rosarion. You will know Carlos from a very notable career. It started with him being an illustrator, doing films such as Batman and Robin, which, if you all know me, it's one of my favorite Batman films, if not my favorite Batman film. Sleepy Hollow, Planet of the Apes, Chicago, and a series of unfortunate events. That is a collection of titles for which Carlos was an illustrator alongside costume designer Colleen Atwood. So, immediate fan. Carlos was also at ACD on Walk the Line, Tron Legacy, Green Lantern, and other projects. And then Carlos has become a costume designer as well in his own right on films such as Don't Breathe and Don't Breathe 2, The Girl in the Spider's Web, and coming soon, which I am super, super excited to talk about, Alien Romulus. You know, I'm going to be all over that film when it comes out. I'm so excited. Shōgun was just such a great show. I'm excited for you all to listen to this interview as we are joined by Carlos Rosario himself to talk about all of the great characters, the textiles, the fabrics, the world building, the research, working with consultants. I'm just such a big fan, and I cannot recommend this series enough. So without any more of me blabbing on and on and on, let's take a little break. And when we come back, we'll be joined by Carlos Rosario. So excited to finally welcome to the podcast someone who I've been dying to meet, honestly, costume designer Carlos Rosario. Hey, Carlos.
Hi, Spencer. Thank you for having me. How are you?
I'm so good. Thank you for coming on. I feel like we've been Instagram pals for a little bit. So when I found out you were doing the costumes for Shōgun, I was like, well, I know this is happening. So
that's so great. Thank you for having me. This is really great to be able to talk to you about this.
Of course. Awesome. Well, I am so excited to talk to you and also talk about this epic series with you. Probably unlike most people, I have not read the book or seen a previous series that came before, which in turns I feel like made this more exciting because I love anything where I feel like I get to learn and learn about a culture that I'm really not familiar with. So with that, the scale of the show, the beauty of it, it's just incredible. So to start from the beginning, how familiar were you with the story and the Japanese Sengoku period?
Well, I mean, I've always been sort of fascinated by the Japanese culture, right, and the Japanese aesthetic, but I didn't know anything about the Sengoku period. It really is when I was approached by one of the producers asking me if I was interested in interviewing for this show that I started looking into it, right? And so when I got the script, I immediately didn't really connect with the characters at that moment. But I started doing research on the period and I really fell in love with the period. And so it was during the pandemic, actually, it was at the end of the pandemic. So, I think I needed to put my energy somewhere. And so I started doing boards and boards about everything, makeup and hair, about everything. And I started doing, I think at the end, I just ended up with 125 boards.
Wow.
And so I edited everything to 30 for my first interview. And then, and that was, my first interview was based on that, just really speaking about the period and all that. But I wasn't really familiar with the Sengoku period. I didn't read the book and I never read the book, mostly because I really wanted to design this show from more of an intuitive place, and give a chance to this show to be its own version. I think that, in the past, I've designed The Girl on the Spiderweb, and, it was based also on a book. And I started reading the book. And when I saw that the book and the script were very different, it started creating some kind of, comparisons. And, it becomes this kind of mental, torture, and so I didn't want to sort of go into that. So I didn't read the script. I didn't read the novel. And then in terms of the miniseries from the 80s, I mean, I was very young, so I knew a couple of, I remember the visuals, some images. I remember obviously Richard Chamberlain, but that's about it.
Right. Gotcha. So we're kind of in the same boat here. And I have to agree with you. Sometimes the book is necessary and sometimes you need your own space to create a new, modern, creative vision. So I appreciate that. So then what did your research process look like then? Were you going to museums? Were you looking at paintings? How did that look like?
So I think that, the most important thing for us was to really study the paintings of that period. Because that's really, at the end of the day, that's really all you have. That is really sort of, that really represents accurately the essence of that period. So we were really in touch with, an incredible expert that teaches at the University of Kyoto in Japan. And he's the one that really helped us to understand them, understand the colors, understand the patterns. And so we went back to that source. So that was the first step. But also we went to all the archives of every single museum in the world, right? And just kind of like study all the the pieces that are still, available really to the public that we could see, and sort of we study them. Of course, the colors have changed, but at least I could see sort of the concepts, the ideas, and that really inspired me. And then, of course, we bought a lot of books. We did a lot of research online. I had an expert that was working with me for 16 months, an expert on textiles. Japanese textiles. So she was really guiding me to understand the meaning of each one of the patterns of that period, which I really used in my textiles and in mostly the uchikakes that I've designed for the female characters, right? And, at the end of the day, we did all that research, but we were really supported by experts along the way that really guided us. And by the end, I remember one of the producers, Kaylin Puente, had, by the 10th episode, she had sort of like a Bible of research of 1,000 pages, right? So it was crazy. It was really definitely research from the first day to the last one.
Well, that actually leads me to my next question. I was going to ask you about your collaboration with consultants, historians, but maybe also cast and crew. What was that collaboration like on set for bringing this vision to life?
So I think that the main consultant that we were in touch with was the one that I just told you with. His name is Frederick Krenz, and he teaches in Kyoto. So he's the one that really sort of helped us to start, right? But at some point, by the second, third episode, we really knew what we needed to do, what we needed to design. Then it became more about the details and understanding the language of the clothing in terms of, the meaning of the patterns, right? So that's something that we did on our own. But except from him, I think we were really sort of helped mostly by our lead actor Hiroyuki Sanada, who really sort of helped us with the small details and understanding sometimes what the character should be wearing in a very specific scene, right? And in a specific location, because the clothing, although it seems very simple, kind of really changes based on the location and the circumstances. So he helped us a little bit with that. But otherwise, yes, there were a lot of consultants on set, but they were mostly consultants about the movements, the gestures, the rituals, things like that, the sword fightings, right? In terms of costumes, I was mostly in touch with that expert in Kyoto.
Right. And also textiles play such a huge role in this show, as I can only imagine.
Absolutely.
So can you discuss the significance of color and textiles in the costume design of Shōgun?
So, the first time I sort of read the first script, the first thing that came to me before even knowing anything about the period and knowing anything about the characters and who they are and all that, what came to me was all about colors and textures. It's really, the question is perfect because those are the two words that came to me as soon as I read the first script, colors and textures. So the textures mostly because I felt like in 1600, it's before the Edo period. The Edo period is always portrayed on screen in a very kind of sophisticated way. And commerce in Japan was very sort of, at that moment, started to become very powerful. And so we are before that. And I just felt like I wanted my clothes to be more in touch with nature, to feel more organic, more raw, something that would just have texture, because it just felt to me that I wanted to give a touch to these costumes that would feel more, period in a sense, less polished, less shiny in a way, right? More rustic in a way. So that was for the textures. And I worked on, many fabrics that would have that aspect for each one of my characters. In terms of the colors, was very important for me because, and that's one of the things that I knew about the novel, is that it describes Toranaga's army as the brown army and Ishido's army as the gray army. And so I thought, my first instinct was, well, if Toranaga's army is brown, by extension, that should be the colors of their lord, Toranaga. So I thought, what is the more elevated colors than brown? And so I went for Toranaga more into golds and coppers, and even burgundies, because I thought it was really a nice touch of, of red in the middle of the gold and the copper, right? So I stayed within the
right.
So that was in the script, it was described in the same way that it was in the novel. And for Ishido, it was the same thing. The concept for Ishido, because I gave a concept for each one of my sort of groups, right, of lords. For him, it was more about ash and fire. So, since it's all gray, metallic silvers, right? So those were the colors for him. And then I added a little bit of fire in there, which was the orange, right? So the concept for him and all his army is gray and orange. And then I did the same thing for all the other lords. And that was really a way for me to sort of conceptualize everything, put everything in containers, different containers. And that really helped me to be very specific about the territory that I could design from for everybody. You know what I mean? Because otherwise there are so many characters that I needed to start with something like that to give me some kind of boundaries between everybody.
Right. And one thing I also noticed too is that it seemed like the villagers or the peasantry also was in blue indigo colors as well too.
Yeah. So for them, well, the indigo color is starts being very predominant a little bit later, but it's still very present at this moment in the Sengoku period. And so I thought that to me, the indigo is really, it really sort of, to me, is the essence of the Japanese culture in a way. Mm-hmm. And so my idea was that the first time the Parrots, sort of Blackthorn and his team, get into Japan, I really wanted them to access the essence of Japan, the way we think of Japan. And so I really use that color only for the villagers, grays and indigos for them, because I wanted the clash of their costume being muddy and dark and gritty, clashing with the indigo of the Japanese villagers, right? And so when you go to the streets of Osaka, it's more pale colors with bolder patterns, but it's pale. And then when you get to the castle with all the lords, the colors are much more flamboyant and, more luxurious in a way.
I'm obsessed with this show. I feel like I have 2 million questions.
That's okay, please. I'm excited to talk about it because, I finished this show in June of 2022. So it's been a long time. And, it was almost 2 years of our lives.
We were whole different people back then.
Absolutely. I mean, I did another movie in between. So it was actually, It's actually exciting to be able to talk about it.
Yeah, well, I mean, congratulations. It's so exciting. And already so many people have been talking to me about this show. Like, are you watching it? Are you watching it? So I think everyone's loving it. Okay. So my other question I want to ask you was how much of Shōgun was built? Because the scale of this show is massive. There are so many costumes, so many background characters. There's a lot. How much of it was built?
So we pretty much built everything. Actually, everything that you see right there on the pictures that you're showing, everything has been made. So we made everything because of that color palette. The color palette was so specific that we had to make everything. Second of all, the characters are very specific, right? And for example, Mariko, she goes through her own emotional journey. So you need to design everything for her because you need a middle, a beginning, a middle, and an end for her. And every character sort of travels in different locations, is facing different circumstances. So it was much better for us to actually make everything. So we could sort of control the color palette, the aesthetic, of the project, the vision of the showrunner, of the showrunners, Justin Marks and Rachel Kondo. And also because we started renting things in Japan and they didn't really first of all, they were not in very good condition. They were very expensive, and it was a completely different color palette. So at the end of the day, we made about 2,300 costumes.
Oh.
We still rented about 1,000 pieces that we sort of incorporated here and there, and we still bought a lot of sort of modern kimonos that we over dyed, and that we used as underlayers in a way, so we could just also coordinate within the female characters the color palette of all the different layers, right? So it was pretty big. Yeah, I mean, I had the most beautiful, incredible, talented workroom that was working nonstop for like 16 months. So it was a treat. It was a treat. And also we had other companies around the world helping us to build everything.
Right. Well, I mean, yeah, shout out to the crew that helped make this happen. I can't imagine, but everyone just did spectacularly. I now want to talk about Hiroyuki Sanada, who I think is just one of the greatest actors. I love him, anything he does. So seeing him take on this role of Lord Toranaga, it was such a treat. So in designing his costumes, how did he use clothing changes to visually emphasize his power and status throughout the series? Because he goes through a lot of changes, I've noticed.
He does go through a lot of changes, and I'm glad that you noticed that, because that was really actually the point.
Oh, good.
When actually we worked on the first episode, I think he has a lot of scenes in the first episode, and consciously we decided that to show his wealth and power, we would actually design a different outfit for every single one of those scenes. So he's actually the only one that changes that much. Actually, Mariko doesn't even change that much, even in the first 2 episodes, right? Then she just, goes to sort of Ajiro. So she starts traveling, and so she has to change. But, I really wanted to show the audience the power of Toranaga and, his wealth. And it was really important to present him in a way that, his rank is above everybody else, so he can actually afford to be changing costumes every single circumstances. But also, it's true that in the first episode, he's hunting, he's in the ceremonial hall, he's in so many different locations, and those different locations are actually asking for this character to always wear something different. So there was a part that made sense historically, but there was also, in a sense, it also made sense for the character itself, for us to show to the audience that he was a very powerful lord.
I can imagine reading a script, just being like, "Oh, there's another one. There's another one."
Yes, but we bought all the fabrics in Japan. So wow. When we got the boxes continuously from two of our customers in Japan, we fell in love with those fabrics, and I'm like, there is no way they're going back to Japan. I have to do something with this, right? And so, I mean, it was important to find those fabrics in Japan. I really think that they capture the essence of the Japanese culture. And I think when I saw them, I was like, I really need to use this and just, create as many outfits for Toranaga.
Well, so there is obviously a lot of action in this series, which in turn brings a lot of mess sometimes. I'm curious to know what your aging and dyeing / breakdown process look like. It's one of my favorite aspects of costume design, and it just was so fun to see in this series.
Thank you. It is actually, I feel the same way as you. I think that that is one of my favorite departments, because I think that really is what brings life and depth to the costume, and and so we were lucky, because for the first 4 or 5 episodes we worked with Matt Reitzma, who has been the textile artist for The Last Samurai and Memoirs of a Geisha.
Oh wow.
So he came on board for the first 5 episodes. It was only available for 5, but then he went he was busy with another project.
We'll take what we could get.
Yeah, no, it was amazing. And so he really helped me to start the project. And he also was very knowledgeable about, Japanese textiles and the meaning of all the patterns and all that. So that was great. And then the last 5 episodes, I worked with 2 Canadian textile artists. Samantha and Lenny Campbell.
Mhm.
And so, it was a very different process. With Matt, he comes with all his he can do anything. He comes with all his machines and he can do the silk screens in the office and everything. So it's very technical and it's, you can get as incredibly, creative as you want. But at the same time, I feel like my best work is towards the end,
Mm.
because with Samantha and Lenny, we sort of created the textiles in a more sort of artistic, creative, organic way, maybe the way it was done at that moment, a lot of hand paint. And so I think that the work that I've done towards the end is probably even more in alignment with the period than the beginning, right? And it takes always a little bit of time to get into it. But so we created all the textiles. We did a lot of hand painting, and we break down pretty much everything that you see on screen. We had about 15 people, working on breaking down all the armors and, pretty much everything. So, I mean, it was really important in order to create sort of the contrast between all these different ranks and these different categories of people from the village to the streets of Osaka and the castle, right? So the breakdown was really a way for us to define all these characters and define the different levels of these characters.
Well, I haven't made it to the end, so you're saying that there's even more incredible costumes I have to look forward to?
Oh, yes, it gets, I mean, yes,
Oh
absolutely.
man.
When you get to episode six is it probably was the most difficult episode to design because it incorporated so many flashbacks.
Oh wow.
And so that one I had to start designing probably 4 months before we started shooting.
Jeez. Well, I'll be calling
And
you when I get to episode 6.
there you go. 6 and 7 are beautiful. All the end is beautiful. It really is stunning. So this is a good, the beginning is a nice way to get introduced into this, emerge into this story, these characters, and into this period.
I'm excited to talk about another character specifically, Mariko. How did you approach the evolution of her costumes to reflect her changing character arc, especially in terms of empowerment and purpose as she goes through her journey?
Mm-hmm. So Mariko was probably the character that I was the most stressed out about because she has become so iconic, right?
Right.
Because of the show in the 80s, and she was so beautifully designed by the costume designer of that show that I knew this one more than anybody else I would be judged for, right? But as I was designing the first few episodes and I really needed to start putting my thoughts together about her, somebody that worked for me told me that she was able to read up to episode 6. And in episode 6, at some point, Buntaro says that the first time he met Mariko, she felt very icy. And so that was my starting point to design Mariko. Because of what happened to her, because she's been dishonored because of what her father has done, the fact that she has tried to commit seppuku every year and she's never been allowed to do that, that in a way she's been forced to marry Buntaro. She lives life in a very sort of lifeless way, in a very spiritless way, and without a soul, right? And so I wanted her costumes to represent that. And that, in a way, really gave me space later on to design the costumes that would be more in alignment with the Mariko that she becomes, right? So in the beginning, I wanted her costumes should be very monochromatic, sort of representing winter. So there is a lot of patterns that represent snow over grass, it's just branches without life. And as she finds her purpose and she finds her voice and, she becomes the translator and she connects with Blackthorn, and she empowers herself. I started introducing the camellias into her costumes. So that was sort of the start of the evolution of her costumes. And towards the end, you start seeing way more patterns, more colors, in a way as she has found her own voice, right? And so that was sort of the emotional arc of who she is from the beginning to the end. And the only way to design Mariko was by understanding what happens to her throughout the 10 episodes. I couldn't just design for the first two. I really needed to know what everything that she was going through in order to have a really wide perspective of what, she needed to look like.
I love that because on the podcast, quite often we always talk about how costume design really is storytelling through characters and what they wear. And I just feel like so much, especially Mariko, but a lot of these characters really represent that idea.
Yeah, I mean, I think all these characters are so complex and each one is so different from each other, right? And it's a very specific period. The period of the Sengoku period is a period of transition too. And so, it was really a fascinating process to understand who they were, right? And design something specifically for them, their rank, and the circumstances they meet.
Well, there's one more character I do want to talk about, which is Blackthorn, who's really falls into a situation I don't think he was expecting. But there also is a lot of evolution in his character as you start to see him be integrated into Japanese culture. So, how did you show that evolution in Blackthorn's character?
Well, for him, I wanted him to once, he starts obviously with his sort of like, breeches and blouse and sort of his pirate look, right? But very soon in the first episode, they remove that identity from him and they dress him in a kosore, right? So the kosore is the ancestor to the kimono. It's sort of the same, but it's a different sort of shape. And it was in a way, a very healthy way to start his costumes with something very basic, very Japanese, very simple, because then it gave me room to, same as Mariko, to add more Japanese elements to his clothing, to his looks. So he starts with a very basic kosore, and as he's introduced more into the Japanese culture, and he surrenders also more to the Japanese culture, he's adding all those Japanese clothing elements that really sort of makes him look way much more like a Japanese character by the end, right? And so I think that was really the only way to design him, by just sort of slowly adding more and more layers, which was really interesting because also it changes the way he would move, right? So in the beginning, he's used to his clothing, but then as soon as he wears the kosore and then he wears the hakama, the tatsukes and the dofuku and the sorenashi and the katagino and everything, it's a different way of moving. It's a different way of talking. It's a different way of behaving. And I feel like that those restrictions, within his clothing really helped him to actually embody the Blackthorn that becomes more Japanese as the story progresses, right? And one aspect also that I took in consideration when I designed him is that, in a way, he's very powerless. In that story, everybody has the power. They are in their territory. They are in their element. But Blackthorn is sort of like the black sheep that comes from another country, right? He needs to learn everything. And so I wanted to keep his sort of color palette very neutral, very muted, very simple, with no patterns or anything. So in a way, it was a nice contrast between him and all the other characters, but also it's a way to show, well, here's a character that is very present within the storyline, but he's also very powerless, And so that was my way of designing Blackthorn.
Quite the journey, and which you have also been on as well with this series. So as we get toward the end, I wanted to ask you, what kind of impact do you hope the costumes will have on the audience's understanding and appreciation of the historical and cultural context of the series?
Well, what I love is, I love how well the show is received and how well the costumes are received. And I think that everything, as I've been doing all these interviews and podcasts and reading the comments online, I can see how much people are appreciating the details, the effort, the passion that we put into respecting this this culture, but also by being so supported by the studio and being able to do our job properly as artists, as costume designers, we are also helping the audience to immerse themselves into this period way much better than if it was done halfway, right? So here's the powers of the visuals of just taking care of, all the details, and I think that at the end of the day, that really is what is helping this show be as successful as what it is. So I hope in the future that the studios take note of this and understand that in a society in which, everybody wants instant gratification of all this, products that are thrown to us every day, right? On all the platforms, right? On Netflix and all those shows that are done really fast, that there's something to say about taking the time to create things properly, and taking the time to respect, the Japanese culture and the Japanese aesthetic and these characters and doing it the right way. Ultimately, visually, the show benefits from it. And I feel like the audience, is, connects much more with the characters and with the storyline.
Right. There really is so much value in just letting artisans be able to have the space and the time and the money to be able to just do their best work. And this shows an example of that. So
absolutely.
What has Shōgun meant to you personally and professionally as a costume designer?
That's a great question. Great question. I think Shōgun, has meant so much because I think this is the first show as a designer in which I can put everything that I know and everything that I've learned. So, I've been in this business for almost 30 years. And I've started as an illustrator for a long time. Then I was an assistant designer. Then I just started a few years ago as a designer, right? But it was a great opportunity for me to finally be able to show everything that I've learned along the way, from all these incredible designers that I've worked for, and all the crews that I've worked for the last 30 years, and all that knowledge, and my knowledge also, because I used to work in fashion, also came into play with also me designing these costumes, because I always approach everything from more like a fashion, sort of fashionable, rounded perspective, right? And so it was just very gratifying to be able to do that, to finally be able to play in a way, with an incredible crew, feeling supported by the studio and doing things the right way.
I'm so happy for you, and I want to say proud too, even though I just met you, but it's really incredible and you should be very proud, because this is really truly an incredible show. But before I let you go, I do have one last question that's actually not Shōgun related. You and I met we met through Instagram DMs when we did our spooky season talking about Sleepy Hollow, and we were talking about your illustration work for Calling Atwood at the time on that film, and it was one of our most popular episodes. So I have to walk back with you a little bit to that time of doing the famous Katrina Van Tassel black and white striped dress. You did an illustration, correct?
I did, yes.
Take us back.
I think those are some of my favorite drawings, actually, because they were all black and white.
Right.
And I remember, I will always remember, I think that's actually really the moment where by looking at Colin Atwood work on Sleepy Hollow, that I realized the infinite possibilities that this job provides, because she had all these tables. And I remember we were working in Hollywood, in Tim Burton's warehouse, right? It was this big warehouse, and she had put all those tables. And on each table, she had started putting, I would see her alone, quietly in silence, putting all these trims and buttons and pieces of fabric, in piles, and she would create these pyramids. And at that moment, I was like, what is she doing? What is she going to do with one button? And so it was really interesting because she was slowly creating from the ground all her characters, right? And at that moment, I was like, wow, this is really fascinating. And I've learned so much from her. I mean, she's one of the most fascinating, powerful, creative human beings that I've met in my life, and I owe her a lot. And so I remember doing those drawings, and she would always come. I remember the references that we would get were mostly paintings, you know, and that one was definitely based on paintings. And yeah, and that was one of my favorite drawings because obviously Tim Burton likes stripes, right? And so that was sort of definitely very, accurate in terms of the period, but it also captures the essence of Tim Burton and also Colin Atwood's style. So it was one of my favorite drawings. Yeah, that was an incredible job, obviously.
That's so cool. I can't believe when you messaged me that it was like out of nowhere. But then that's interesting though, of you like watching Colin Atwood work. Do you feel like just through your career as an assistant costume designer, as an illustrator, now that you're this really incredible costume designer working on Shōgun, did you ever catch yourself just kind of being like, oh, like Colleen used to do this, or, this designer used to do this? Like, how much do you feel like that all prepared you for what you're doing now with Shōgun?
Well, everything, because I feel like every single costume designer that I worked for works in a completely different way. And so that was really interesting for me because now, I've designed Alien. Alien is so different from Shōgun.
Oh my God, we haven't talked about Alien yet.
But every approach is different. You have to start working on a show with a blank canvas, right? And so the fact that I was able to work with all these incredibly talented designers and everybody has their own different approach of designing a project really helped me to sort of be very versatile, and be very be ready to find solutions, in a second, and being able to navigate all the different things that we face as costume designers on every project, and all that. I'm the extension of all these incredible designers that came before me, so I'm very grateful to all of them. I mean, I am really, I've learned because of them, so all the expertise that I have right now is because of their past, and their experiences.
It's awesome. Well, costume designer Carlos Rosario, it has been such a pleasure and honor. Thank you so much for coming. And I hope that we could talk again soon about your next space film project, TV series. I'm very excited to talk about because I'm a big nerd. So we'll be talking again soon.
Sounds great. Thank you for having me on the show. That's very exciting. Thank you, Spencer.
The Art of Costume podcast is hosted and produced by Elizabeth Joy Glass and Spencer Williams. Our audio engineering and editing is done by Dan White. Follow us on TikTok at The Art of Costume and Instagram at The Art of Costume Pod. If you want to support the show, go to theartofcostume.com/podstore. For more podcast updates, costume reviews, deep dives, and interviews, go to theartofcostume.com, a blog dedicated to highlighting the best in costume design.